Hi and welcome. This is part 3 in a series that I've called Evidence for God, and we've been looking in these talks just trying to think out loud, really just trying to go back to first principles if we can, just try to think through, are there some pointers, some bits of evidence that do point towards God's existence. We're not going to prove God's existence because he isn't in that category. God is not an apple falling from a tree that you can measure the acceleration of and produce an equation. That's what science does really, really well. I've got a degree in maths and physics. My background is science. I love science and the scientific enterprise. However, there are things that fall outside the category of scientific investigation. Science cannot apply itself to everything in the universe, and we've got to put certain limits around it. And most good scientists would acknowledge that. So we aren't going to prove God scientifically, but nevertheless we can think about signposts. Are there things that hint and suggest and point towards God's existence? And we've already thought about the existence and the beauty and the structure and the mathematics of our universe. Then in the second talk we thought about our human experience. What does our spirituality and our morality and our rationality say about who we are? They suggest that we're more than just atoms and molecules, more than just flesh and blood. And if there is spirit or soul to us, then where did that come from? What is the origin of that? That was our second argument. And today I want to head off in another direction entirely, and I want to think about the person of Jesus Christ, and in particular the New Testament claims to his resurrection. Because if indeed that did happen, then that's an incredibly big piece of evidence pointing in God's direction. And of course, if it didn't happen, then actually the whole of Christianity falls apart. The Bible is very, very clear that the whole of Christianity stands or falls on the claim of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So that seemed a fairly crucial and key point to have a look at, and that's what I want to do in this session. Now, of course, as soon as I say something like the resurrection, there are those who will say, look, wait a minute, Richard, stop right there. Dead people do not come back to life. And of course, the answer to that is, well done, correct, you are right. Dead people do not come back to life. That is against the laws of chemistry and biology and physics and everything else. Dead people do not come back to life. That's right. And that is exactly what makes this Christian claim so interesting. If dead people did come back to life, then even on an occasional basis, then the claims of the resurrection would not be interesting at all. Christianity would not be interesting or intriguing at all. The very fact that dead people do not come back to life is exactly what makes the claims of the resurrection worthy of inspection, because Christianity is claiming something miraculous, something completely one-off, extraordinary, outside of the normal box, and that's what makes the claim worthy of inspection. What's really important then is that we have some grasp on what the methods of that inspection should be, that we go about it the right way. You cannot, it is a category error, you cannot take any claim to miracle and simply say, well, that didn't happen because it breaks the laws of science. That is a philosophical mistake of the first order. The laws of science are descriptive, they are not prescriptive. They describe how the universe works on a normal average Wednesday afternoon, but they do not prescribe. The laws of science do not tell the universe how to operate. They describe how it operates on a normal day, but they are not prescriptive. And it seems to me that if there is a God, And I recognise in these talks that's an if that we're thinking about, but if there is a God, there is no reason why he should not be able, on occasion, to supersede and suspend those normal laws of science in order to do some God stuff now and again. And so the investigation around whether he's done that or not cannot proceed on the basis of just denying it because science doesn't allow it. That's a major error. If there is a claim to miracle, we have to investigate it in the way that a court would, in the way that a lawyer would. We've got to look at the evidence, we've got to look at the legal and historical circumstances around the claim. We've got to bring in the witnesses and put them in the dock and ask ourselves, are they reliable witnesses? And we've got to work in that manner. We've actually got to take that procedure for anything of an historical nature, for any claim, whether it's something that Julius Caesar's written in his book or anybody else in history. If you want to work out, is it true, you can't just take an a priori position on it based on your philosophy or your science. You've got to go back and look at the historical detail, the witnesses, the events of the time, and we've got to do that with the resurrection. So, is there any real historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ? Of course, the main place to go is the New Testament documents, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, the letters of Paul. That's where the main body of evidence is to be found. There are references to Jesus and to the claims of the church to his resurrection to be found outside of the New Testament in other ancient Roman and Jewish documents. So we know that, the early church was making this claim. We know that other people of the day were aware of it. So there is wider circumstantial evidence to the fact that this claim was being made. That doesn't make it true, of course, but it does make us aware that it's not just the New Testament that we're reliant on for our sources. So, how do we get our head around this evidence? Something that happened 2,000 years ago. It's not easy. The witnesses aren't alive. We can't bring them into court, stand them in the dock, cross-examine them. But we can access the written evidence that's there and that's been left behind. There's a very interesting book because I'm only going to have time to give you a few pointers on this, but that I would point you to. This is a very early edition. I think it's still in print. It's the book Who Moved the Stone by Frank Morison. Morison was legally trained and actually rather sceptical about the miraculous claims of Christianity, sceptical about the resurrection, and set out to write a book, really, that would research that final week of Jesus' life. And this is what he says he wanted to do. He says, the purpose of my book that I'd planned was to take this last phase of the life of Jesus with all its pulsating drama, its sharp, clear-cut background of antiquity, and its tremendous psychological and human interest, and strip it of its overgrowth of primitive beliefs and dogmatic suppositions. In other words, he wanted to get through to the basics and sort of get rid of the superstition that had grown up around it. But his first chapter in this book is called The Book That Refused to Be Written, because the closer he looked, the more this sharp mind, this legal mind, this historical mind found that the evidence pointed to something supernatural. And he says this. He says, things emerged from that story which previously I would have thought impossible. Slowly but very definitely the conviction grew that the drama of those unforgettable weeks of human history was stranger and deeper than it seemed. Fascinating book, recommend it to you, probably a penny on Amazon. But what sort of evidence does he look at? Well, Well, in brief, one of the first things we've got to point to is the disappearance, the absence of Jesus' body from the tomb. Nobody has ever given a satisfactory explanation of what happened to the body of Jesus Christ. If it were available to either the Roman or the Jewish authorities, make no mistake, they would have wheeled it out through the streets in a wheelbarrow to crush this early Christian claim that Jesus was alive. It's clear historically that they were never able to do that and did not do that, that they did not have the body. Some have suggested that perhaps the disciples stole it, but I find that even harder to believe. Many of the disciples were martyred for their faith. And I have to ask the question, would anyone die for what they knew was a lie? Many people have given their lives for a deception, for a delusion, but would you die for what you knew was a lie? If the body of Jesus was hidden in your attic and you were out preaching the resurrection, knowing full well it was a lie, would you at the point of the sword continue that lie when you know you've got the body hidden and you've made it up? That seems entirely unlikely to me. In fact, the whole witness of the disciples is very, very interesting. They are clearly convinced that something very real and physical and definite has happened. And we have their records, we have their accounts to go from. Those accounts have a ring of truth about them. They have all sorts of marks within them that suggest that they have not been made up. One of the most amazing ones is the fact that the New Testament records that the first witnesses to the resurrection were women, were the female followers of Jesus. In that day, a woman's testimony was not allowed in court. It was not given any credence in a Jewish court, such was the subjection of women in those days. If you were going to invent a story of this scale and level, you would not ever in a million years have as your primary witnesses a woman. You just wouldn't do that. The fact that the New Testament does suggests to me that what we have here is a plain telling of the truth and not something that was made up. One thing that's really important to understand when it comes to the New Testament documents is that we do have the actual writings that these people wrote, that they have not been altered over time. That can be proved. That can be proved by the science of textual criticism. The situation is that we've got about 5,000 fragments or even full copies in some cases of the New Testament dating back to about 300 AD, not that long in historical terms after the originals were written. And those documents form like a family tree of documents, and because we don't have the originals, but copies were made, and copies of copies, and copies of copies of copies. And if these things had been altered, if you'd got what many people claim, very Chinese whispers, the story just gets altered and altered and altered, you would be able to see that in the family tree of documents. Because if one document is altered by somebody 100 years later and a bit's added and made up, then every other document that copies that one contains that particular error, contains that particular piece of fiction. But the rest of the family tree doesn't. It's like the way DNA passes down a family tree. And if by AD 300 you've got 5,000 documents, and if, as is the case, you can study those documents and discover that they are 97-98% the same, only a few small grammatical and other small alterations here and there, you have absolute proof of the accuracy and reliability of the textual transmission process, that anybody copying these documents did stick to what they had in front of them and did not do a Chinese whispers process. What that tells us is that the transmission of what Matthew, Mark, Luke and John wrote is reliable. Now it's still another question to ask, did they write the truth? But at least we can get back to that level. We can dismiss any question of error creeping in the transmission, because it would show up in that family tree of documents. Now, as I say, it's another question. Did they actually write the truth in the first place? And then you've got to look a bit deeper. You've got to ask, do these witnesses sound reliable? Would they die for a lie, for what they knew was a lie? And are there elements within the text which point to that authentic ring of truth rather than to something fictional? And that's where Frank Morison really goes to work. And he actually focuses quite strongly on some of the small discrepancies in the text between the gospel accounts, and there are discrepancies. And he traces the potential introduction of those discrepancies. They're only minor, to do with how many angels were at the tomb. Was it one? Was it two? How many women went? Things like that. What Frank Morison points out is that those type of discrepancies are exactly what you would expect from an authentic telling of a story by different sources. Just like 4 newspapers today will report on a story, and there will be differences of detail between the journalistic accounts. But what that actually points to is authentic journalism, not to the whole thing being a piece of fiction. And what Frank Morison does is he explores some of those differences between the gospel texts and actually draws a very strong argument that they strengthen the case for the authenticity of reporting and for the evidence for the resurrection. Our time is gone. I've only been able to give you a few pointers there. But what we can say is that we do have an accurately transmitted record of what those first disciples wrote. The question then is, did they write the truth? It seems to me if they gave up their lives for it, they clearly believed, sincerely believed, it was the truth. And we then have to look at, is there a better explanation for all of the evidence than simply to accept that on that occasion there was a miracle from God? The more I look at it, and I look at it with a scientific and an historical mind, it seems to me that that is indeed the best explanation. That Jesus Christ was uniquely, because he was God's Son, raised from the dead. See you next time.
I fill my life with things that take my eyes off you and all you call me to. Live just to please myself.